The Greenskins, fierce and savage, have long been a scourge upon the borders of the Empire. But make no mistake, they are not to be underestimated. Their armies are massive, bolstered by the sheer numbers they can muster at a moment's notice. They are led by cunning war bosses who use their wits and brute strength to crush any who stand in their way. But do not be fooled by their crude tactics and barbaric ways. The Greenskins have a unique talent for warfare, and their armies are more than just a mindless horde. They have powerful units such as trolls, strong melee infantry, and fierce heroes who can tear apart some of the best units in battle. Even worse for any that might face them, their economy relies on looting and sacking settlements, which means they constantly grow stronger with each victory. They are a force to be reckoned with, and would soon devour the world if they are not stopped, if they can be stopped.
Welcome everyone, Christine here with my Greenskin Campaign meta guide, the first in a series of videos where I'll be discussing about the best playstyles for every single race, be it recruitment, lords, heroes, structures, and the way you want to play your campaign, also research and other things as well. The Greenskins are one of the more powerful races in the game. In a previous video, I talked about how being an aggressive expansionist is the best playstyle in Total War Warhammer 3. Well, the Greenskins excel at that playstyle because of the various faction benefits. They have very cheap units early on that are pretty effective, they have a pretty powerful early game economy, and they have scaling for an aggressive expansionist through the raiding stashes. Basically, Greenskins by default gain a significant amount of money when they're sacking and looting settlements. The raiding stashes can be built in any tier 3 settlement, so provincial capitals and minor settlements. And this gives you a benefit to income from sacking and looting settlements by 2%. And post-battle loot of 3%. And this stacks, so the more of these you have, the more amount of money you'll be gaining in your faction. But it's not just the only thing. There's also ancillaries that increase this even further, like the Snarling Scavengers that give you 10%. Then there's, of course, Lord effects. For instance, Ravager gives you 15%, and then some Legendary Lords effects as well. That means the Greenskins, who can't trade, depend on sacking and looting settlements. You play them as aggressive expansionists. Your economy might look like this, where you're not necessarily generating a huge amount of money. You might be losing a lot of money each turn, but it doesn't matter. As long as you can sack one settlement each turn, you'll have enough money to keep you going. And that's how you do it. This is my Grom the Punch campaign that I played, and look at just the situation I have. I have 3 armies on Wolf 1, building a 4th over there, and 3 armies over here by turn 42. And this is not necessarily an easy campaign as Grom the Punch, because you have to deal with a lot of unpleasant climate until you get into Wolf 1. In fact, it can be quite difficult, though of course Grom has all the tools needed to succeed in this kind of campaign situation. So that's one of the key elements of the Greenskins. But they're not too shabby at holding territory. They have a commandment that might as well read that is an I win button. It gives you 20 growth to control and reduces corruption. It is extraordinarily good. And then there is the Waaagh mechanic. Now, the Waaagh meter, as it fills up, it gives you faction-wide benefits, and when it fills up, you can declare a Waaagh against the target. In this case, I declared a Waaagh against Nakari. Now, what does a Waaagh do? Well, a Waaagh basically attaches another army to each army in your faction. Now, these are disposable units. Some of them can be good, like the trolls over here, but for the most part, the units you get are relatively disposable. Not really great units. Some good units, but mostly pretty bad ones. But it doesn't matter. These units, they're there for the mass of Greenskins, the Green Tide. And the thing about the Waaagh meter is that it gives you some of the following effects. It gives you 30 growth, 6 obedience, and leadership at a fairly high level. Or I think it's 5 obedience actually. So you're gaining a lot of control in a territory. You're gaining leadership faction-wide, and you're also gaining a lot of growth. And the Greenskins certainly will be rolling in cash, and their structures can also be very cheap early on, now requiring a lot of money compared to some other factions. Like, just their base economic building generates 250 income, and costs 250 income. So their early game structures are really cheap. They do get a lot more expensive as you play for the campaign, but having that kind of those kind of cheap structures early on really suits the playstyle of aggressive expansionists that the Greenskins are. And same with their units. Their early game units are really cheap to recruit, relatively cheap to maintain, and pretty solid as units overall, whereas their higher tier units, like the Rogue Idol, can cost quite a bit. So the Greenskins have scalability. They have scalability in their empire, they have scalability in their unit rosters. They just are a green tide that will conquer the entire world. Now, let's talk about their lord and hero choices. Well, their lord choices aren't really that good, to be quite honest. You have 3 of them: Goblin Great Shamans, Night Goblin War Bosses, and Orc War Bosses. Night Goblin War Bosses are kind of pointless to use. They were added in the Skarsnik DLC. They are also the worst lore choice by far. They don't have a great skill line, their melee ability isn't really that great. They might be useful in ambushes, but you don't have like an ambush movement stance like, say, the Skaven or Olifanar or the Beastman. So they're kind of a bit pointless. The best skill, one of the better skills they have, is that they give melee attack for Goblin and Night Goblin units. Here's the reason these guys are pointless and you should never bother with them. You have the Goblin Great Shamans. Now, the Goblin Great Shamans don't have the melee ability, but they can ride an Arachne Rock Spider, which in itself is a significant melee ability. So while you lack the melee skill line on these guys, they certainly have a decent amount of melee combat ability. But obviously they're caster lords, so you should use them as such. The most important thing, however, for Goblin Great Shamans is that they have the Goblin Tide skill, which gives 15 armor for all Goblin units and 6 melee attack. That is significant because a lot of Goblin units may have low armor. Improving that by 15 is a ridiculous level of power that you can get in your campaign for all of your armies. And then you have the Orc War Bosses. These are more of a late game choice, really, in a campaign. I'm not sure why this guy actually has the riders. But the thing about the Orc War Bosses is while they lack the Goblin Tide skill line, they do have one advantage. They're the best melee combatants of the lords. They can ride a wyvern, which in itself can be pretty useful to have because of its HP, its flying ability, which helps them in battle. But when it comes down to it, it really is just that simple. The Goblin Great Shamans are the best choice to use as lords. So some fairly limited lord choices. What about heroes? What hero choices do they have during the course of their campaign? Well, they can get the Goblin Big Boss. He has Scavenge, which gives you more post-battle loot. They're decent enough melee fighter, though not really that great when it comes to it. They're kind of a bit, they're pretty weak in a lot of ways, these guys. They're actually the least useful of the heroes, and they require a tier 2 structure to build, but they require a tier 4 structure in order to increase their hero capacity. So you won't have a lot of Goblin Big Bosses running around, but that's no problem. Now, other better heroes are Shamans, Giant River Troll Hags, they can get at tier 3, and Black Orc Big Bosses. Now, these guys are actually really good, all of these guys, with the exception of the Night Goblin Shamans. Talking about Shamans, when it comes down to it, Orc Shamans are just better than Night Goblin Shamans in every singular way. They just have a better spell line. When it comes to it, they have better survivability. They'll just do better in battle. There's nothing quite like throwing a foot of Gork on your enemy. Besides, when it comes to the Night Goblin Shamans, because you are going to use a lot of Goblin Great Shamans, you'll have that spell line anyway when it comes to your faction. So you can have both spell lines in your armies, faction-wide, relatively easily if you're playing the Greenskins. The Black Orc Big Bosses are pretty powerful melee fighters. Heroic Killing Blow, Warboar, Dodgy Geezer, Training, lots of armor, lots of survivability in battle, leadership benefits, melee attack benefits, as well as this particular skill line where you do have to make a choice. Like you can get casualty replenishment for orc units, and then you can get vigor loss reduction for orc units, or get a benefit to get the Deadly Onslaught ability for them, for Linecracker, or get a benefit to Assault Garrison Assault units. Basically, Linecracker is the one you want to go for, unless you have a lot of Orc units in an army, like Black Orcs over there. So in that case, you might want to get Boss of the Field over there. And then bonus versus large and armor piercing damage. Pretty good melee fighters when it comes down to it. As for the Giant River Troll Hags, they're decent but not particularly great as fighters. They have a decent amount of HP, but they can't get armor skills. They also have only a limited amount of melee defense you can get with them, though you can get the Deadly Onslaught. They also have the Lore of Death skill line, which is okay, but doesn't compare to the Orc Shamans. The most important thing when it comes to the Giant River Troll Hags is that they have replenishment. Greenskins can take a lot of damage in battles because a lot of their units don't necessarily have the best armor on them. And because of that particular situation, you need the ability to replenish. Well, having Giant River Troll Hags, which Grom the Punch over here starts with, one of them, gives you quite a lot of replenishment in your territory. So that is actually very significant when you are playing as the Greenskins, because it will really allow you to recover from any losses you suffer in battles relatively quickly. Some of their heroes are really good, like these three right here are all pretty great. The Goblin Big Boss, mediocre, and their lore choices, I would say, overall are mediocre, with the exception of that one particular skill that the Goblin Great Shaman has, though you do need to level them up to a relatively high level in order to use that Goblin Tide. But once you get them on an Arachnoid Spider, like I did in this particular case, they do get a decent level of power when it comes down to it. Now, with that in mind, let's talk about unit recruitment and what units you should use if you're playing as the Greenskins. From any tier 1 settlement, they can recruit Goblin Archers or Goblins. Goblins are pretty worthless in a battle. They're just not good units in any way, shape, or form. They have poor leadership, though at least they have the expendable trait, so you don't really care about losing them in battle. They just aren't going to do very well. However, the Goblin Archers are a very different beast. They might have short range, but they do a decent amount of missile strength, can get a decent level of armor, and you can really mass these guys in very, very large numbers pretty quickly. Like over here, at this point in the campaign, recruiting a Goblin Archer is 300 or so. Though over here there is a commandment that I'm using that lowers the recruitment cost, so 330. That is pretty ridiculous. Their upkeep cost might be a bit higher, but bear in mind what I mentioned about the Greenskin economy. Greenskins earning a lot of money from sacking settlements. Now, what's crucial when it comes to unit recruitment for the Greenskins is the following fact. Every settlement they take in a province increases their local recruitment capacity by 1. So, if you have a province like this, you're gaining plus 3 local recruitment capacity very, very quickly over here, and can be plus 4. That's before you consider the commandment as well as some other effects that the Greenskins can benefit from. So they can recruit a lot of units very, very quickly, be it local recruitment or in combination with global recruitment as well, for which you can also increase capacity. And that's one of the key strengths of the Greenskins early on in the campaign. Especially, they can recruit a lot of units very quickly. And you should, in virtually every Greenskin campaign, recruit a full stack in just a couple of turns, 2 turns, something like that, and just unleash them on their enemies. Hell, recruit 2 full stacks in a couple of turns and unleash them on your enemies. It doesn't matter which faction you're facing, just unleashing 2 stacks of Goblin Archers as well as your starting army should be enough to overcome any threat that any Greenskin faces in their campaign early on. Unless you do decide to play as Grom and conquer Alpha Lorem in the early game, then maybe not, but even then, you might have actually a really good chance of doing so if you so desire. So those are some of the things you should know if you're dealing with the Greenskins. That you can recruit units very quickly and very, very cheaply early on, just the Goblin Archers. The Orc Boys that you can recruit from Tier 1 barracks are not worth it. In fact, the barracks itself at Tier 1 is not worth it at all. So if you start with a Tier 1 settlement and you don't have the ability of instantly building it to Tier 2, just get rid of the barracks and get a lot of Goblin Archers. things do change at Tier 2 fairly significantly when it comes down to it, because you do get the Tier 2 barracks, which gives you Nasty Skulkers. If you own the the Skarsnik DLC, you can recruit Nasty Skulkers. If you don't, just keep recruiting Goblin Archers, and you also get access to Trolls. Now, let's talk a bit about Nasty Skulkers, because they are one of the most ridiculous units in the entire game. Greenskins, when it comes to their research situation, are fairly simple to understand. A lot of their research is just basically going to buff up their units. Some faction-wide benefits like campaign movement range, sure, or post-battle loot, but most of the time what you're looking at this research tree is unit buffs. Now, the thing about unit buffs is that the tree over here on the left side is heavily focused on goblins. You're looking at leadership, missile strength, melee attack, armor +7 for goblins, scrap upgrades for goblin. Every greenskin unit can use a scrap upgrade. Like for Nasty Skulkers, it's either bonus versus infantry or perfect vigor, both of which are pretty damn good. Depends on the situation. Generally, I prefer going for that bonus versus infantry, but you certainly won't do wrong really with perfect vigor. Then again, vigor is not necessarily important for Nasty Skulkers considering how ridiculous these guys are. Their baseline stats, if I open the unit and spell browser, their baseline stats don't necessarily look too good, though bear in mind they have a decent level of speed, a decent level of melee attack, and also the vast majority of their damage is armor-piercing damage. This is actually very important when we're dealing with the Nasty Skulkers, because these guys can fight the vast majority of infantry units in the game, or the vast majority of units in the game, throughout the entire game and win. Because the more you play the campaign, the stronger they get, obviously, through the various upgrades, for the Goblin Tide. This guy has the Goblin Tide, obviously, so he's got that armor benefit and melee attack benefit. Just look at the stats over here at the rank 5 unit. They're like 37 armor, which is better than Imperial Swordsman. They have 60 leadership, 43 speed, 47 melee attack. There aren't tier 5 units in the game that can get 47 melee attack, a decent level of melee defense, and a ridiculous level of armor-piercing damage. They're also resistant, they can also survive ranged units, which might be a good counter to them because they have stock, so they're hidden. So good luck shooting them in range. They have Vanguard deployment, and also, if they're engaged in melee, they get a ridiculous amount of armor piercing and melee attack. So the baseline stats might as well be a lie, because when you're engaged in melee, you're getting plus 12 melee attack and plus 40% armor piercing damage. I'm not joking, these guys can win against great swords, or do very well against great swords, even if you're not accounting for unit upgrades, let alone and things like Chaos Warriors and many other melee infantry units. They'll tear apart archers, they'll sneak up on them, destroy them. What about cavalry? Cavalry could handle them. No, cavalry can't handle them because cavalry relies on getting charges and cycle charging. Well, the Nasty Skulkers have a counter to that as well. They can reduce the charge speed and the speed of units by using smoke bombs. So if a cavalry unit is charging your line, just use smoke bombs and watch them do absolutely nothing to these guys. These guys can take a charge directly to the face and then slaughter Bretonnian knights and Imperial knights with ease. It's a bit ridiculous. Then we have to talk about the tier 2 trolls. I believe I have some units somewhere. Oh, yeah, this guy. So, tier 2 trolls, not necessarily the best leadership, but a decent level of armor and pretty good melee stats. These are your siege breakers, your basic siege breakers. You know how some races are powerful because they get artillery to smash down walls? Well, greenskins don't need no bloody artillery. The trolls are your siege equipment. What you do with these guys is you throw them through the gate of any settlement, and they'll stand up to pretty much anything the enemy can throw against them. They might struggle, of course, against mass range units, but when it comes to range units and siege bells, that is a complication for the defender. And then keep in mind that your goblin archers, like, you should not necessarily get too many trolls, but because you can obviously support them with a bunch of goblin archers behind the lines shooting at enemies over the walls, and then Nasty Skulkers can climb over the walls undetected, flank the enemy that are engaged at the gates, and kill everything in sight. That is the Greenskin tier 2 meta in battles. Tier 2, just remember what we're talking about here. Tier 2, everything that I just discussed. At tier 3, things get even better, because as opposed to regular trolls, which have a low level armor, you get stone trolls and river trolls. Now, I don't necessarily care much for river trolls, though they do have certainly some benefits in terms of debuffing enemies, but most of the time I don't bother with them. Stone trolls, however, which do take 2 units to recruit, are just basically the better version of the trolls. Still pretty low leadership, so they'll break, but they do have, all of them have regeneration, they cause fear, and these guys have a high level of armor, spell resistance. These guys can compete with Treekin in a battle in quite a lot of ways when it comes down to it. I'm sure Treekin would beat them in a straight-up fight just because of the leadership situation, but both of them serve the same purpose. They're siege breakers. They go for the gates, they survive everything that's thrown against them, they kill everything in sight, and in the case of the Greenskins, they allow the rest of your army to climb over the walls and kill the enemy in sight. That's just with the trolls. And of course, you can also increase your capacity for giant river troll hags, which you should for the sake of replenishment at tier 3. Then you also get Night Goblin Archers, Orc Biggins, and Night Goblins at tier 3 for a barracks. Now, I don't necessarily think Biggins are worth investing in unless you're playing like Azag, who get some benefits with them. Certainly, they're a pretty solid melee unit, but you already have a solid melee unit. What you really want to get at tier 3 are Night Goblin Archers. Basically the improved version of the Goblin Archers. They have poison attacks. They have better stats overall. Still relatively low level of armor, but it doesn't matter in a lot of ways. Like, they're just the better version. They'll handle themselves better in virtually every battle and every kind of situation that they might encounter in a campaign. And then, of course, at tier 4, you do get some even better choices. You get the Fanatics, the Night Goblin Fanatics. Now, the Fanatics are basically, they basically have a suicide team inside them that can do quite a bit of damage to the enemy. Though, yes, you're going to suffer some casualties because of that, unfortunately, but still, there's a good amount of power when it comes to that. And then you have one of your, the ultimate melee infantry, the Black Orcs themselves. Very high level of armor, high level of leadership, good stats all around the board. These guys are also great. And then, of course, you have some other choices. Arachnarok Spiders at tier 4 as well. Pretty solid units in a lot of ways. Giants, if you want to use them. I personally wouldn't. I don't really care for giants. And then you can get Doomdiver catapults. But the artillery kind of feels a bit pointless with the Greenskins, because by the time the artillery can do the job, like, you can get Rock Lobbers at tier 3 and Doomdivers at tier 4. For open field battles, I guess, you know, Doomdivers are okay, especially considering you steer the Goblin that's flying with them. But for siege battles, of which you're going to be fighting a lot during the course of a campaign, just kind of feel redundant for the Greenskins. Can be useful in some cases if you're dealing with really powerful towers and you want to deal with them quickly, so you should always have some artillery, but I found playing Greenskin campaigns just how worthless artillery is, because when you can just take your entire army and smash through the gates and kill everything in sight, while your nasty skulkers are just climbing over doors to flank the enemy, then yeah, it becomes a bit redundant. And then at tier 5, you have one of the most powerful and durable units in the entire game, the ultimate siege breaker in the entire game in terms of the Rogue Idol. So what you should recruit, though, is at tier 1, Goblin Archers. At tier 2, start getting nasty Skulkers and Trolls. At tier 3, switch to Stone Trolls and Night Goblin Archers. And at tier 4, if you can afford it, they can be pretty expensive, you want to switch to Black Orcs. And, of course, go for Night Goblin Archer Fanatics as well. Rock Lobbers are a pretty solid artillery unit, 2 of them in every army, and eventually replace them with Doomdivers. Their cavalry line is really not worth considering. It's not bad, but you don't really need them. You absolutely don't need them. Why need cavalry when you can use trolls in an army? That's what it comes down to. Like, these guys just, they're good in field battles, but they're not going to serve any real purpose in a siege. Arachnarok and Rogue Idols can be nice if you just want a big unit to throw at the blob of enemy units that can survive and dish out quite a bit of damage, especially in the case of the Rogue Idol. And that's the case with the unit roster of the Greenskins, what you should focus on. Get a lot of Goblin Archers, a huge amount, 2 full stacks. You can afford this from very early on in your campaign. And then, yes, nasty Skulkers, Trolls, and just upgrades to the trolls. And then eventually, if you really want some powerful melee infantry that are finally worth using, the Black Orcs themselves. The only Orc unit that's actually worth using in the entire Greenskin roster. It's certainly Goblin-centric at the moment, which is a bit of a shame. We could use, I guess, some improvements to some of the Orc units in the roster early on, because there's no reason whatsoever to bother with the Orc Archer boys. A part of the reason why you should never bother with the Orc Archer boys is because of the way the upgrades work in the research tree, so I think there need to be some changes when it comes to that, but still, ridiculous level of power when it comes to their unit roster. Finally, let's talk about the buildings that the Greenskins do have in their campaign and what you should build. Obviously, landmarks, if you have them, are useful to build if they provide a positive effect. But generally speaking, when you're just taking over a settlement, like let's just say you start with a settlement. Over here in Grom's campaign, you start with a massive oracle. It has a barracks. The first thing you should do over here, by the way, is get rid of the barracks and get the idols. Typically speaking, in a Greenskin campaign, you don't need growth, but very, very early on in a campaign, you might benefit from getting this growth building. It's very cheap, it's very easy to upgrade. And then, of course, getting the pile of shiny stuff into the Horde, getting that very, very quickly and trying to get as many of these as possible during the course of your campaign. You can trade, so actually getting this can be fairly important. At Tier 2, though, you should at least get one Tier 2 barracks, preferably in the provincial capital, because you're going to need it to unlock the Tier 4 barracks. So when it comes to provincial capitals, they should always have the Black Orc barracks. And minor settlements should basically be filled with the Horde, as well as some other structures. You might even put the Hag Hut in a minor settlement as opposed to a provincial capital, because outside of getting the giants, you're not really benefiting all that much when it comes to the Tier 4 stomping grounds over there. So this is while this is obviously a great structure, it's not necessarily worth putting there. As for the Shaman's Hut at Tier 3, you should ideally put this in a provincial capital, but remember that even at Tier 3, it still increases your hero capacity for shamans. Though, of course, there's obviously some significant benefits if you can put it in a provincial capital. So this would ideally be placed in a provincial capital, but you can still take advantage of it in a minor settlement. Also, should be noted that every settlement, once it's Tier 3, you should always try and get raiding stashes. So the priority is obviously getting some growth early on, but you will be able to get rid of the idols very, very quickly, because the Waaagh growth affects the commandment once you get control of the province. Unless it's the kind of province like the Massive Oracle, which only has one settlement, then you might just keep the idols there for a fairly long time. Here I got rid of them because I wanted other buildings, but still. And you want to get raiding stashes in as many settlements as possible, because that's going to give you a significant benefit. As for the boss's tent, that's not really worth bothering with that much until you get to a relatively high level. Like until you get to a Tier 4 settlement, it's just not worth bothering with this building, unless you're building one early on to get with the one goblin big boss that you can get. But once you get to Tier 4, that's when you start building these guys in provincial capitals. So provincial capitals should always have a barracks, and you may want to have a boss's shack. Beyond that, you may want to have a shaman hut in them. The stomping grounds as well, you can benefit from. And if you want to get the Ragnaroks, of course, you can get the building chain. The thing about it, though, this entire building chain, the units that you get here, they're all worthless with the exception of the Ragnarok. And while the Ragnarok is a good unit, I'm not sure it's worth sacrificing an entire building slot just to be able to get them. Unless you're much later on in the campaign and you just want to get some Ragnaroks to play around with, because you're not going to benefit from this building chain at lower levels. Whereas with the shamanic TP, you will benefit from it faction-wide. Shaman recruitment, of course, it will really help you out. And of course, troll recruitment. And that's all there is to say, really, about the Greenskins, some of their priorities. Obviously, economy and raiding stashes are a priority in general. Recruitment structures, though, especially the ones that increase hero capacity, however, are pretty important. Shamans are one thing. Shamans and Giant River Troll Hags are some things that you should typically prioritize quite heavily. Siege can be useful, of course, as well. Don't underestimate the ability there, because also the research rate from the siege structure is not something to be underestimated. Though I would say it's not really a priority to focus on the siege. The Goblin Workshop, it's not really a priority because you don't need siege as much as some other factions do. And that's all there is to say. Kostin signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications, and stay tuned for more.